It's been pretty well documented by many news outlets, including here in State of Charge, that the Chevrolet Equinox EV isn't the best DC fast charging electric vehicle. In fact, in its respective class, it's one of the worst. But that doesn't mean it's not a good electric vehicle. I've had my Chevrolet Equinox now for about 6 months. I really like it. I think it's a great value. It has a lot to offer. It just doesn't DC fast charge that well. Now, I did put out a video a couple of months ago in which I recorded a 0 to 100% charging session and also 20 to 80%. But since then, I've done a lot of DC fast charge recordings. I'm going to put out a couple of videos, one of which, the one we're going to talk about here today, is 10 to 80% charging sessions. And I think that's important because 10 to 80% is kind of the ideal segment of the charging curve for DC fast charging road trips. Because I know most people don't want to take an EV down under 10%. They don't feel comfortable, especially when they're on a road trip and far from home. So 10% starting point and an 80% ending point is just about the sweet spot to unplug and move on to the next charger if you're on a long road trip. So I took my Equinox and I charged it from 10% to 80% on a 250 kilowatt Tesla Supercharger, also on a 350 kilowatt EVgo DC fast charger, and a 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charger, so I could demonstrate what you could expect if you're charging your Equinox from 10 to 80% on those 3 different types of DC fast chargers. Now, DC fast chargers aren't all created equal. I think most people understand that. But if you don't, you have to know that there's different power levels, different amperage that different stations can put out. And your vehicle is going to charge differently depending on where you plug it in. So I took 3 very different types of DC fast chargers and charged the Equinox from 10 to 80%, so you could see what to expect if you plug in your Equinox and charge from 10 to 80% on those 3 different types of DC fast chargers. So with that said, let's get into it. Okay, so I mentioned that the Equinox isn't a very good DC fast charging electric vehicle. Why is that? Well, there's a couple reasons, but I think the main reason is that the Equinox's battery pack has exceptionally lower voltage. And that makes a big difference because the amount of power that an electric vehicle can take in it's rated in kilowatts. And that's basically the pack voltage times the amperage that it's taking. And if the pack voltage is low, as is the case with the Equinox, it's one of, if not the lowest pack voltage of any electric vehicle out there today, then it needs to accept higher amperage, more current, to be able to charge quickly. Now, Chevrolet says that the Equinox's maximum DC fast charging rate is 150 kilowatts, which in itself doesn't sound too bad. It's not great by today's standards, but it's not too bad. But when you get into the details, you realize, yeah, it's actually worse than it sounds. And that's because of the fact that it's such a low voltage battery pack. It needs to accept 500 amps in order to charge at 150 kilowatts. And it only does so for a very short period of time in the beginning of the charging curve if the vehicle is at a very low state of charge. That in itself is not unusual. Many EVs do that. They only accept their maximum power for a short period of time at the beginning of the charging curve, and then it starts to lower the charging intake. But what makes the Equinox so bad, as I mentioned, was the fact that it has this low voltage battery pack, so it needs to take in 500 amps. The problem with that is not all DC fast chargers can deliver 500 amps. For instance, and you're going to see us later on charging on an Electrify America 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. That maxes out at 350 amps. But you'd say, well, it advertises that it's a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. It should be able to put out 150 kilowatts. Well, it can, as long as the pack voltage on your electric vehicle is greater than 430 volts, because it's volt times amp. So do the math and you can see about how much power you can roughly take in. Now we say 400 volt and 800 volt battery systems, but the numbers are always somewhere between. Like the Equinox, for instance, is considered a 400 volt battery system. but the starting voltage, the pack voltage when the battery is very low or say empty, is under 300 volts. And it goes up to, I think, 335 volts is its maximum. So the range is a little under 300 volts to 335 volts, but it's considered a 400 volt battery pack system. Now, that's just how the industry works. I mean, you'll have Lucid Air at the other end of the spectrum. People say, well, it's got an 800 volt battery system, but it can actually charge at over 900 volts. But just to make it easier, we kind of put all the EVs in two different buckets, 400 volt systems, 800 volt systems. So the Equinox is a 400 volt system, but the pack voltage is actually much lower. And if you get DC fast charger, while it might advertise that it can deliver 150 kilowatts, so you'd say, well, the Equinox can only charge at 150 kilowatts, so I might as well use that charger. That's not the case. You're not going to pull even near 150 kilowatts because of the amperage limit on the 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers. There's 200 kilowatt DC fast chargers out there, 100, 350, 400, there's all different power levels. So when you go to a DC fast charger, use either your in-car navigation that tells you the power limit, or there's apps out there like ChargeWay and PlugShare that give you a lot of detailed information on the charging station so you know what you're getting into when you arrive. And in particular, if you have an Equinox, it makes sense to find the DC fast chargers that have higher amperage. And those are typically the ones that are 350 kilowatt or 400 kilowatt DC fast chargers. Or now that you can access the Tesla Supercharger network with your Equinox, you can use Tesla Superchargers. They also have higher amperage. They're over 500 amps. So you'll see in the recording now how well the Equinox charges on the Tesla Supercharger. Okay, so I hope I didn't confuse you more with what I just tried to explain. Basically, in a nutshell, the Equinox's poor DC fast charging performance is primarily because it has such a low voltage battery pack, and you have to find the right DC fast charger for it to charge faster. How much faster? Well, that's what we're going to find out now, because I'm going to have my side-by-side recordings of all three recordings from 10 to 80% on a 250 kilowatt Tesla Supercharger, a 350 kilowatt EVgo DC fast charger, and a 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charger. We're going to put them side by side, and you can see exactly how long it takes the Equinox to go from 10 to 80%. The only one caveat I'm going to mention before we start, you'll notice on the Electrify America charge recording, it starts at 9%. And I charged it from 9% to 79%. That's because when I arrived, the car said it was at 10% state of charge, but when I plugged in, the screen on the DC fast charger said 9%. So I shut it off at 79%. So it's basically the same window. It's 70% of the battery. And whether you're going to charge from 9% to 79% or 10% to 80%, it's not going to make any difference time-wise, maybe 10 seconds. So it's not going to disrupt our side-by-side comparison. But I want to point that out before you see the recording, because it does go from 9 to 79%, where the other two recordings go from 10 to 80%. Okay, with that said, let's take a look at the side-by-side recordings, and then we'll follow that up with looking at the charts, and we'll analyze the three charging sessions and see exactly how much of a difference it is when you charge on any one of those three chargers. This video was sponsored by Qmerit, North America's premier installer of electric vehicle charging equipment. After I've helped you decide which electric vehicle charger you're going to buy, follow the link in the description of my videos and have Qmerit install it. And if you follow that link, Qmerit will waive the $150 installation deposit. But in order to have the deposit waived, you must follow the link in the description of my videos. Okay, so on this split screen, I have the 250 kilowatt Tesla Supercharger on top, the 350 kilowatt EVgo charging station on the lower left, and in the lower right, the 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charger. As the sessions start, you can see both the EVgo station and the Supercharger are delivering just about the full 500 amps that the Equinox can accept, and do so for the first 7.5 minutes, although the EVgo station is delivering a few more kilowatt, so it does jump out to a very early slight lead. The 150 kilowatt Electrify America station, on the other hand, started out delivering about 90 kilowatt, and that's gradually increasing as the pack voltage increases, but it never goes higher than 96 kilowatt, which it reaches after 21 minutes of charging. Both the Supercharger and the EVgo stations started lowering their charging speed after 7.5 minutes, but the EVgo station started a dramatic drop after 14 minutes, and the Supercharger didn't follow that drop until 19 minutes of charging, and in that 5-minute span, closed the gap and actually jumped out in front of the EVgo charging session, and it's never going to relinquish that lead. The Supercharger finished up the 10 to 80% session in 39 minutes and had a 1% lead on the EVgo station and a 9% advantage over the 150 kilowatt Electrify America station. The EVgo station took 1 minute longer and finished in 40 minutes, while the 150 kilowatt charger had the Equinox at 72% state of charge at that point. And then 4 minutes later, after 44 minutes of charging, the 150 kilowatt Electrify America charger reached 80% state of charge and the session ended. Okay, so not that big of a difference, but you can see that the 150 kilowatt station was significantly slower. We had 39 minutes for the Tesla Supercharger, 40 minutes for the 350 kilowatt DC fast charger from the EVgo network. Although I have to mention, those are pretty much neck and neck. I know I have a 1 minute difference in the video, but honestly, we're talking probably 30 seconds of a difference in time. As you could see with the Tesla recording, I have the screen of the Equinox because the Tesla Superchargers don't have a display screen for me to record. But if you really slow it down and you look at the seconds, it's less than a minute of a difference between those two. So it's virtually a tie on the 250 kilowatt Supercharger and the 350 kilowatt EVgo station. Now the 150 kilowatt Electrify America station, you could see how much less power it was taking in the whole time. And that made it charge about 4 minutes slower than the other two. Now, that's not that big of a difference when you think about it. When you're on a long road trip and you're plugging in and charging, it's about 10% longer. So, if you do find a 150 kilowatt station and there aren't anything better than that, there's no Superchargers, no 350 available, you're looking at about 4 minutes longer to charge from 10% to 80%. So really not that big of a deal. But if you're on a very long road trip and you're stopping multiple times, it adds up. And if you're waiting for it to finish, I'll take that extra 4 minutes anytime. So, okay, that's what it looked like on the time-lapse recording. Now let's take a look at how it looks like on paper. First up, let's take a look at the charging power chart. And on this chart, on the x-axis, it is the state of charge. And on the y-axis, we have the charging power in kilowatts. This is all three charging sessions. I have the 350 kilowatt EVgo charging session listed in blue, the 250 kilowatt Tesla Supercharger session in red, and the 150 kilowatt Electrify America charging session in black. So first up, let's just take a look at the EVgo and Tesla Supercharger sessions because they're very similar, and quite honestly, I'm surprised they're not exactly the same, and that's because both of these stations can deliver the full 500 amps that the Equinox is going to call for in the beginning of the charging session. So I really expected these two to be nearly identical, and they almost are, with just two differences. Now, the first difference, which is the most obvious and the biggest difference, is that after about 14 minutes of charging, the session on the EVgo charger dramatically reduced its charging rate from around 125 kilowatt all the way down to about 70 kilowatts. And the Tesla Supercharger session does that also, but it held the higher charging rate for 5 minutes longer, and it doesn't drop down here until after 19 minutes of charging. I really don't know why this happen. You wouldn't expect it to happen in the charging curve. The only thing that I can think of is the Equinox's battery or some module in the charging system got a little bit too hot on the EVgo charging session and derated a little bit earlier than it would, let's say, on its normal charging curve. Because other than that, these are extremely similar. If you could extend this line out to where the Tesla Supercharger started to derate, these curves would probably look nearly identical, except for the only other difference, which is also a very slight difference. Along the whole charging curve, except for that one session that I just talked about, the EVgo station did deliver a little bit more power than the Tesla Supercharger did. And you can see that highlighted here in green. Now, when we take a look at the time that the Supercharger delivered more power, you could see it's a much fatter area. And that's the reason why the Supercharger session finished 1 minute before the EVgo session did. If we didn't have this area here, the EVgo station for sure would have probably finished up a minute or two faster than the Supercharger did. And now let's take a look at the 150 kilowatt charging session. This is about as flat a curve as you're going to get. And when I plugged in, it was pulling 90 kilowatts, and it gradually increased up to 96 kilowatt when the vehicle was at 46% state of charge. Then you've got this little blip down here where it dropped about 10 kilowatt and then held that straight out till I think it was around 67% state of charge. And that's when it starts doing its gradual drop down to 80% here. So you can really see how limited the Equinox is charging on a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger, because it's just not going to get the amps that it's calling for. And that on the positive side does allow you to have this flat charging curve here. You know pretty much exactly what you're getting with this. It's going to be nearly a straight line up until about 70%, where it starts to slightly taper off. And finally, while slow and steady doesn't always win the race, sometimes it does help you to catch up. Take a look at the shaded areas I have here. The green shaded area is the portion of the charging session that the 150 kilowatt Electrify America charger actually outperformed the 350 kilowatt EVgo DC fast charger. And the yellow section is where it outperformed both the EVgo station and the Tesla Supercharger. This is primarily because after charging at a high rate for a long period of time, the two sessions that were charging at the higher rate needed to lower their charging rates and cool off the components in the battery. Whereas the 150 kilowatt session didn't stress the battery or charging components, so it was able to hold a higher charging rate for a longer period of time, actually throughout the whole session here. And the interesting thing is, after about 17 minutes of charging, the EVgo station was 14% state of charge ahead of the 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. But when the EVgo station finished and reached 80%, it was only 8% ahead of the 150 kilowatt station. So the 150 kilowatt charger actually started catching up in the second half of these charging sessions. Next up, let's take a look at the time to charge charts. And on these charts, on the x-axis, you have the charge time in minutes, and on the y-axis, it's the state of charge. And you can see here in the first 23 minutes of the charging sessions, the EVgo station had a considerable lead, but that evaporated. And for the remainder of the charging session, the Tesla Supercharger actually was slightly ahead of the EVgo station, finishing up 1 minute earlier. Whereas the 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charger has nearly a perfectly straight line, but did charge considerably slower. And you can also see that the gap between the EVgo station and the two other stations is at its widest, right around the 23-minute mark. But after that, it slowly narrows, and that indicates that the Electrify America station was catching up. However, it wasn't closing the gap fast enough, and ended up finishing 4 to 5 minutes later than the other two charging sessions. So this is the same chart, except I've isolated the Tesla Supercharger charging session. You could see the 10 miles per minute dotted line and also the 5 miles per minute dotted line. I use these miles per minute guidelines to demonstrate just how fast you're replenishing range. And you can see the little box on the lower right-hand corner. I have two columns, one for the EPA rated range, which is 319 miles for my front-wheel drive 2RS Equinox. And I also have a 70-mile-an-hour range column. And that's because I did a 70-mile-an-hour highway range test with this vehicle, and I finished up with 303 miles. So in the first 10 minutes of charging, we replenished 6.6 miles of range according to the EPA range rating and 6.3 miles of range according to my range test. In the second 10 minutes of charging, from 10 minutes to 20 minutes, we added 6.8 miles of range according to EPA, 6.5 miles of range according to my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. And then from the 20 to 30 minute point, we added 4.8 miles of range and 4.6 miles of range for my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. You could tell as the state of charge gets higher, the range replenishing rate lowers. Next up, let's take a look at the EVgo charging session. You can see this curve is very similar to the Supercharger curve, except it started out a little bit better. In the first 10 minutes, we actually had 7.9 miles of range per minute, according to EPA, and 7.5 miles of range per minute if you want to use my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. But then take a look at the 10 to 20 minute point. It drops all the way down to 5.7 and 5.4 respectively. And that's when the charging rate really slowed up. For the final 10 minutes, it slowed up even further, 4.1 and 3.9 miles of range added for every minute charging. And now let's take a look at the 150 kilowatt Electrify America charging session. The first thing you'll probably notice is I removed the 10 miles per minute guideline because this whole charging session is nearly perfectly on the 5 miles per minute line. I've actually never seen that before in any of my charging tests. Okay, so the first 10 minutes of charging, we added 4.9 miles per minute and 4.7 miles per minute respectively. The second 10 minutes, it actually crept up a little bit, 5.2 and 4.9. And then for the 20 to 30 and 30 to 40 minute sections, we had the same range replenishing rate, 5.1 miles of range added for every minute of charging according to the EPA and 4.8 according to my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. So you could see this entire session is nearly 5 miles per minute consistently for the whole 40 minutes. So this a model of consistency, not really good consistency, because I usually say anything under 5 miles per minute is actually pretty bad for DC fast charging. This is right along that rate. So I'm not going to say it's terrible, but it really isn't good. It's consistent, but it's really not good high-speed DC fast charging. And it's why I've kind of been hard on the Equinox as far as DC fast charging goes. Most electric vehicles today will charge faster than this on a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. And now we're going to take an even deeper dive into the range replenishing rate. I talked earlier about miles per minute. Now we're going to take a look at the actual driving range and how long it takes to add 50 miles, 100 miles, 150 miles, and 200 miles of driving range, comparing the Tesla Supercharger, the 350 kilowatt DC fast charger, and the 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. Let's get into it. Okay, so first up, we'll take a look at the 350 kilowatt DC fast charger session. You can see there's two sets of points. The points on top of the line are according to the EPA range rating. The points on the bottom of the line are according to my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. Now this is the regular time to charge chart, just with the miles added to it. All right, now let's take a look at the totals. Okay, to add 50 miles of range takes 6 seconds according to the EPA and 6 seconds according to my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. It's that close. It starts to separate when you go a little bit longer though. 100 miles comes in 12.6 minutes and 13.4 minutes. 150 miles, 22.4 minutes, 24.3 minutes. And if you want to add 200 miles of driving range, you can do that in about 34.1 minutes according to the EPA scale. If you use my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test, it's going to take you 36.4 minutes, and this is all while charging on a 350 kilowatt DC fast charger. Next up, let's take a look at the Tesla Supercharger. Now, if you remember, the Supercharger was a little bit slower than the 350 kilowatt charger early on, but then it caught up and passed it at the very end. You can see here it takes 7.2 minutes and 7.7 minutes respectively to add 50 miles of driving range. 100 miles is 14.6 and 15.4. 150 miles, 22.2 and 23.7. But then when we go to 200 miles, this is where the Supercharger actually did it slightly faster than the 350 kilowatt charger. It's 33.3 minutes according to EPA, 35.7 according to my 70 mile an hour highway range test. And lastly, let's take a look at the data on the 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charger. When it comes to adding 50 miles of range, 9.6 seconds and 10 seconds respectively. 100 miles takes 19 minutes and 20.1 minutes. 150, 28.9 and 30.4. 200 miles takes a while, 38.7 minutes according to EPA, and just about 41 minutes according to my 70 mile an hour highway range test. And those are not impressive numbers there. Now let's take a quick look at all three of these sessions compared. So there's no reason to go through all of the numbers, but it's nice to see them all side by side. Real quick though, let's take an overview. To add 50 miles of driving range, the spread is from 6 minutes all the way up to 10 minutes, depending on which charger you're on and which metric you want to use, my range test or EPA. 200 miles, look at the spread there, 34.1 minutes all the way up to 40.9 minutes. So it does take considerably longer when you're on a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. And I also want to note, take a look at the bottom there. I don't want this video to give the impression that Electrify America's chargers are slower than EVgo's chargers. They have 350 kilowatt chargers also, and EVgo also has slower chargers. I just used a 150 kilowatt charger from Electrify America because I needed to compare a 150 kilowatt unit to a 350 kilowatt unit. It doesn't matter what network it's on. If the chargers are performing properly, they should all have the same output. So this isn't to imply that Electrify America is inferior to EVgo. It's not. The 350 kilowatt chargers on Electrify America work just fine. Well, when they're working, they actually work just fine. But the Tesla Supercharger is really the one that I was curious about comparing. And to my surprise, it actually performed the best if you were to stay and replenish 200 miles of driving range. If you just want to plug in for, say, 5 or 10 minutes, the 350 kilowatt EVgo charger actually is a little bit better. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but it's a little bit better if you're just going to plug in for 10 minutes. You'll get a few more miles squeezed in there, but the 150 kilowatt station, because of the low pack voltage of the Equinox, is going to be trailing by quite a bit. You're going to be there for a few more minutes regardless of how long you want to charge for and how many miles you need to add. And finally, we're going to look at the master charging chart for the 350 kilowatt EVgo charging station session. And this chart shows all of the data that anybody could possibly ask for on this specific charging session. Now, if you take a look at the bottom on the legend, you could see that there's different color boxes. The light green color boxes represent the times of the charging session that the vehicle was accepting 80 to 100% of the maximum charging rate that it took during this charging session. The darker green represents when it was pulling 60 to 79% of its maximum charging rate. And in the beige boxes, the vehicle was accepting 40 to 59% of the maximum charging power that it took during this session. Each box represents 10% of this charging session. And you can start and end at any percentage. You could look at 10% to 50%, from 30% to 60%. Whatever section of the charging session that you want to view data from, that's listed in that little box. And each box shows how much time that 10% block took, how much state of charge was added in that block, how many miles of EPA rated range was added, what was the average charging power during that session, and also how much energy, how many kilowatt hours were added in that little block. Now I'm going to take a look at the full charging session, which would be the 10% starting point to the 80% finishing point here. And you can see it took 40 minutes. We added 70% of the battery, which was 223 miles according to the EPA range rating. The average charging power over the entire session was 103 kilowatt, and we added 60 kilowatt hour. Now let's say we wanted to take a look at 30% to 60%. You could see here it took 18 minutes. We added 30% of the battery. We added 96 miles. The average charging power was 103 kilowatt, and we added 26 kilowatt hour. I'm not going to go over all these boxes. It would take us quite some time. And I'm not going to go over this data for the other two charging sessions. What I am going to do is pull them up on the screen so somebody could take a screenshot if they want to. This is the Tesla Supercharging charging session. And next we'll take a look at the 150 kilowatt Electrify America DC fast charging session. You can take screenshots of these. Look at them all you want. I know a lot of my followers print these up, put them in their glove box just so they can have them for future reference. And they're also going to be shown in an article that I'm going to write on my website, evchargingstations.com, with this video embedded in a day or two. You'll be able to read a written article that accompanies this video and also download the charts and graphs that I've used in this video. Okay, so what did we learn here today? Well, if you start at a low state of charge and you're at a DC fast charger that can deliver the full 500 amps that the Equinox is going to call for the first 7 to 8 minutes of charging, you will get the maximum power that the Equinox can take in, which is around 150 kilowatts. Now, the Supercharger can do it. The 350 kilowatt DC fast chargers out there on any network can also do that. But the lower powered DC fast chargers, like the 150 kilowatt unit that we used here today from the Electrify America network, can't put out 500 amps. So they're going to charge significantly slower. How much slower? Well, we looked at about 40 minutes for the DC fast chargers that could deliver the full 500 amps, and about 44 to 45 minutes for the ones that can't. Now, I say 44 to 45. I know in this video we stopped it at 44 minutes, but it didn't show the seconds, and it was actually around 44 minutes and I think 45 seconds at the time. So it's actually closer to 45 minutes. So you got to wait about 5 minutes longer if you're on a 150 kilowatt DC fast charger. Does that really make that much of a difference? Well, it depends. If you're on a road trip and you're making multiple stops, it can add up. If you live in an apartment and you don't have the ability to charge at home, like I can here, you're going to use DC fast chargers frequently, then yeah, you know, if it's an extra 5 minutes, it's an extra 5 minutes every week or so when you're stopping to charge the vehicle once a week, it can add up. The Equinox EV is not a good DC fast charging electric vehicle. I can't make that any clearer. Is it terrible? I wouldn't say it's terrible, but it's borderline on terrible. It's a shame that General Motors came out with the vehicle in 2024 that charges as poorly as it does on a DC fast charger. But does that mean you shouldn't buy one? Absolutely not. I love my Equinox. I wouldn't trade it. I charge primarily at home. I don't need to use DC fast chargers that often. And when I do, I don't mind waiting an extra 5 or 10 minutes. You know, for instance, you look at some of the competing electric vehicles out there. Its direct competitor would be, say, a Tesla Model Y. That can go 10 to 80% in about 30 minutes. So it's about 10 minutes faster than the Equinox can. Top of class would be like a Hyundai Ioniq 5 or Kia EV6. They can do the 10 to 80 in about 20 minutes. So it's about half the time of an Equinox. So if you lived in an apartment and you don't have the ability to charge at level 2 and you're going to rely primarily on DC fast charging, say once a week, go and fill her up, you might want to consider an EV that can charge a little bit quicker on a DC fast charger, like those that I just mentioned. But if you can charge at home and you're only going to use DC fast chargers on occasion when you go someplace very far away, that's kind of the situation I'm in, then I definitely wouldn't let that hold me back from getting the Equinox. You're going to wait a few minutes longer once a month or every couple of months when you go on a long road trip. really isn't going to make that much of a difference. If you use it for work and you're going to DC fast charge once or twice a week, there are options out there that will charge faster. But as I said, I wouldn't let that hold me back from buying an Equinox. I think it's a really good electric vehicle at a very good price. It's one of the most affordable electric vehicles on the market today that go over, well, it's the most affordable one that goes over 300 miles of range. And I proved that with my 70-mile-an-hour highway range test. It went 303 miles at 70 miles an hour. Now, it wasn't good weather. It's cold now in the winter. It doesn't quite go 300 miles. I'm going to try to do a cold weather range test soon. I was going to do one, and then my car got into an accident. I don't know if you saw. I already put out a video. Somebody hit it while it was parked. So unfortunately, I can't do the cold weather range test right now, but I will. I'm curious to see how far it goes at 70 miles an hour in cold temperatures. But when it was warm out, it went over 300 miles. And for a car that starts in the low $30,000 range, you just can't beat it for value. The DC fast charging isn't the greatest, but as I said, a lot of people don't care about that. If you can charge at level 2, most people really, it doesn't matter how well the car DC fast charges because they're almost never going to need to go to a DC fast charger. But if you're one of those that do, it is a consideration to make, and that's why we do these videos to show people exactly what they can expect. Listen, if this is your first time here at State of Charge, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming electric vehicle news and reviews. And as always, thanks for watching.